At dawn on September 3, 1260, a tense silence settled over the valley of Ain Jalut. Across the narrow plain stood the army of the Mamluk Sultanate, disciplined, watchful, outnumbered. Somewhere beyond the hills waited the forces of the Mongol Empire, the most feared war machine the world had ever seen. Cities had fallen before them like dry timber before a wildfire. Baghdad had burned. Entire civilizations had collapsed. For a generation, the Mongols had been less an army than a force of nature. And yet, on that morning, one man believed they could be stopped. His name was Baibars. He was not born to royalty. He did not inherit a throne. In fact, he had once been bought and sold as property. But now he stood at the center of a moment that would decide the fate of the Islamic world, and perhaps alter the trajectory of global history. The Battle of Ain Jalut was more than a military confrontation. It was a civilizational crossroads. If the Mongols advanced into Egypt, the last major power standing in their path would fall. Trade routes, cultural centers, and the fragile balance of power across the Middle East would be shattered. What happened next would prove that dominance is never permanent, that strategy can overcome terror, and that leadership can emerge from the most unlikely origins. But before we understand how the Mongols were defeated, we must ask a more compelling question. How did a slave rise to stand against an empire? Long before he stood in the valley of Ain Jalut facing the most feared army on earth, Baibars was just a boy on the vast Eurasian steppe. He was born around 1223 into a Kipchak Turkic tribe, in a world defined by open skies, windswept grasslands, and the constant uncertainty of nomadic life. Survival there depended on toughness, mobility, and instinct. Tribes moved with their herds, children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk, and conflict was never far away. It was a hard world, but it was free. That freedom did not last. In the chaos of tribal warfare and slave raids that rippled across the region, the young Baibars was captured. One day he belonged to a family and a tribe. The next, he was cargo. He was transported across trade routes that linked the Black Sea to the great markets of the Middle East, part of a brutal but highly organized system that treated human beings as assets. For many boys taken from the steppe, this was the end of identity and the beginning of anonymity. But for Baibars, it was the beginning of something else. He was eventually sold in Egypt and absorbed into the military structure of the Mamluk Sultanate. To modern ears, the word slave suggests permanent powerlessness. The Mamluk system was more complicated. Young foreign boys, often Turks or Circassians, were purchased, converted to Islam, and placed into an elite military training program. They were cut off from their original tribes and loyalties and reshaped into a new brotherhood defined by discipline, hierarchy, and absolute commitment to the state. It was ruthless by design. Isolation broke old allegiances. Training built new ones. Inside the barracks, sentiment had no value. What mattered was performance. The Mamluks trained relentlessly in mounted archery, swordsmanship, formation tactics, and coordinated cavalry maneuvers. They drilled until movements became instinct. They learned not just how to fight, but how to think strategically, how to read terrain, anticipate flanking maneuvers, and exploit weakness. Education extended beyond the battlefield. They studied Arabic, Islamic law, and statecraft. The goal was not simply to produce soldiers, but to produce a military elite capable of governing. For many, the system was crushing. For Baibars, it was transformative. He was not physically perfect. Historical accounts mention a facial scar and a pale eye, features that reportedly made him less desirable in slave markets. He was sold at a lower price than others. In a society that valued physical perfection in its warrior class, that could have been a permanent disadvantage. But one of the defining traits of Baibars' life was his refusal to let initial conditions dictate final outcomes. In modern entrepreneurial language, he did not control his starting capital, but he controlled his execution. Baibars distinguished himself early. He mastered the composite bow, the signature weapon of steppe warfare, combining the instincts of his nomadic upbringing with the structured discipline of Mamluk training. He developed strength in heavy cavalry combat, learning to operate within tight formations while maintaining individual initiative. Most importantly, he showed something rare: composure under pressure. Commanders noticed that he did not panic. He observed. He calculated. He adapted. The 13th century was not a stable time to come of age. The Ayyubid dynasty founded by Saladin was weakening. Crusader states still clung to fortresses along the Levantine coast. Political rivalries fractured Muslim territories. In that instability, opportunity existed for those prepared to seize it. Baibars' first major tests came in campaigns against Crusader strongholds in the eastern Mediterranean. These were not glamorous battles. They were grueling sieges, raids, and counter-raids that demanded endurance and tactical precision. Fortresses such as Croix de Chevaliers represented not just military obstacles but symbols of foreign control. Fighting in these campaigns exposed Baibars to real-world command dynamics, coordination between cavalry and infantry, supply management, siege logistics, and the psychological dimensions of warfare. He did more than follow orders. He learned patterns. Leaders begin to emerge long before they hold titles. Fellow Mamluks began to see in Baibars a rare combination, ferocity in combat paired with strategic patience. He understood when to press and when to withdraw. He recognized that victory was not about theatrical heroics but about positioning. That mindset, prioritizing long-term advantage over short-term glory, would later define his greatest triumph. The Mamluk military structure allowed for mobility based on merit. Unlike hereditary aristocracies, where lineage dictated advancement, the Mamluk hierarchy was brutal but pragmatic. Skill, loyalty, and political intelligence determined survival. This created an environment not unlike a high-stakes startup ecosystem, volatile, competitive, unforgiving, but open to those who could outperform their peers. Baibars rose steadily. He gained the trust of senior commanders. He commanded units. He built alliances within the officer corps. He understood that power was never purely military, it was relational. Influence depended on networks, reputation, and perceived competence. He cultivated all three. At the same time, a storm was gathering beyond Egypt's borders. The Mongol Empire was expanding westward with terrifying speed. Cities that had stood for centuries were erased in months. Reports of massacres and engineered terror preceded Mongol armies, weakening resistance before battles even began. In 1258, Baghdad, the symbolic heart of the Islamic world, was destroyed. The psychological shock reverberated across the region. For ambitious Mamluk officers, this was both existential threat and defining opportunity. Baibars recognized something others missed. The Mongols were devastatingly effective, but they were not supernatural. Their strength lay in mobility, intelligence networks, disciplined cavalry coordination, and psychological warfare. The strengths, properly understood, could be countered, but it would require leadership willing to abandon conventional pride and embrace unconventional tactics. By the time the Mongol tide reached Syria, Baibars was no longer a marginal figure. He had proven himself in combat. He had earned loyalty. He had built a reputation as a commander who combined aggression with foresight. More importantly, he had internalized a lesson forged from childhood trauma and military discipline alike: survival favors adaptation. For an American audience accustomed to stories of self-made founders and leaders who rise from obscurity, Baibars' early life carries a familiar arc. He did not inherit leverage. He built it. He entered a system designed to control him and mastered its rules so thoroughly that he began to shape it from within. Every hardship, the loss of his homeland, the brutality of training, the prejudice attached to his physical imperfections, hardened rather than diminished him. Character is not formed in comfort. It is formed in constraint. By his early 30s, Baibars stood at a crossroads. He was no longer merely a soldier shaped by the Mamluk system. He was becoming one of its architects. The boy captured on the steppe had transformed into a strategist capable of influencing the fate of kingdoms. Yet his defining test still lay ahead. The rise from slave to commander was remarkable. But the rise from commander to civilization-defining leader would require something more: the willingness to confront an enemy the world believed could not be defeated. And when that moment arrived in 1260, In a valley called Ain Jalut, everything Baibars had endured, every lesson in discipline, every scar earned in training, every political calculation, would converge. The making of the man had prepared him for the making of history. By the middle of the 13th century, the world had never seen anything like the Mongol Empire at its peak. From the windswept plains of East Asia to the edges of Eastern Europe, a single political force stretched across continents. It was not merely vast, it was fast. Mongol armies could move hundreds of miles in weeks, coordinating across distances that would have paralyzed any other medieval state. Their cavalry functioned like a living network, disciplined, adaptive, relentless. For merchants, this empire would eventually create new trade corridors and a strange kind of stability. But in its expansion phase, it was defined by something far more immediate: shock and annihilation. Entire cities were erased. Populations were slaughtered not only as punishment but as strategy. Resistance was met with extermination. Submission sometimes spared lives, but never autonomy. The Mongols did not simply conquer territory. They dismantled systems of power and replaced them with their own. This was the geopolitical reality facing the Islamic world in the 1250s. For centuries, Islamic civilization had been one of the most advanced on earth. Its scholars preserved and expanded classical knowledge. Its cities were centers of trade, finance, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. At the symbolic heart of this world stood Baghdad, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. Baghdad was more than a political seat. It was an idea, a beacon, a place where wealth and intellect intersected. Libraries housed thousands of manuscripts. Courts debated theology and science. Caravans from Africa, India, and Central Asia converged in its markets. For over 500 years, the Abbasid caliphs had represented continuity, however imperfect, of Islamic political authority. Then in 1258, that continuity ended. When the Mongol armies under Hulagu Khan approached Baghdad, they offered the caliph a choice: submit or face destruction. Miscalculating the threat, the caliph refused to fully comply. What followed was catastrophic. The siege was swift and devastating. Walls were breached. Defenses collapsed. The city was stormed. The fall of Baghdad in 1258 was not just another conquest. It was a civilizational trauma. Contemporary accounts describe streets running red, libraries burned, scholars killed, and institutions shattered. Whether some of the numbers were exaggerated or not, the psychological impact was undeniable. The Abbasid Caliph was executed. The political center of the Islamic world was decapitated in a matter of days. For many across the Middle East, it felt apocalyptic. If Baghdad could fall, what could possibly stand? The Mongols did not pause. After Iraq, they moved into Syria. One by one, major cities capitulated or were crushed. Aleppo fell. Damascus surrendered. The pattern was becoming predictable: swift encirclement, overwhelming assault, calculated terror. The Mongol war machine seemed unstoppable, guided by commanders who combined battlefield brilliance with a chilling willingness to annihilate resistance. The collapse of Islamic political power was not only military, it was psychological. Regional rulers who might have coordinated defense instead hesitated, negotiated, or fled. The old structures that once provided unity were fractured. The Abbasid Caliphate had offered symbolic cohesion even when real power was decentralized. Now that symbol was gone. This is the part of the story where most civilizations disappear from history. When the center collapses, the periphery rarely holds. But there was one exception. To the southwest, beyond the Sinai Desert, lay Egypt. And in Egypt, a different kind of power had quietly consolidated itself: the Mamluk Sultanate. Unlike hereditary monarchies, the Mamluk state was led by former slave soldiers, men trained from youth for discipline and war. They were not bound by aristocratic lineage but by military brotherhood and ambition. It was a system forged in harsh conditions, where advancement depended on competence and loyalty rather than birthright. When news of Baghdad's destruction reached Cairo, the shock was immediate. But unlike other courts paralyzed by fear, the Mamluks understood something essential: submission would not guarantee survival. The Mongols respected strength, not diplomacy. Cities that surrendered could still be punished. Rulers who bent the knee could still be replaced. Egypt now stood as the last major stronghold in the central Islamic world capable of mounting a serious defense. If it fell, North Africa would be exposed. The holy cities of Mecca and Medina would be vulnerable. The economic arteries connecting the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean would fracture. This was no longer a regional conflict. It was a pivot point in world history. For American entrepreneurs and builders watching this story unfold centuries later, the dynamic feels familiar in principle if not in scale. When a dominant force disrupts an entire industry, whether through technology, capital, or speed, legacy players often freeze. They rely on old assumptions. They hope the wave will pass. But occasionally, a leaner, more adaptive organization recognizes the moment for what it is, existential. That was Egypt in 1259. The Mongols sent envoys demanding submission. Their message was clear and consistent with previous campaigns: surrender peacefully and be incorporated, or resist and be destroyed. The envoys carried the weight of a reputation built on burned cities and broken dynasties. The Mamluk leadership made a decision that shocked observers. The envoys were executed. It was an act of open defiance, calculated, risky, irreversible. Diplomacy was no longer an option. War was inevitable. Behind this decision was a new sultan, Kuz, and among his leading commanders was a battle-hardened general who had risen through the Mamluk ranks, Baibars. He understood the Mongols not as myth, but as men. He had seen steppe warfare. He knew their mobility, their feigned retreats, their psychological tactics. Most importantly, he believed they could be beaten, not through brute force, but through strategy. Still, belief alone does not stop an army. The Mamluks began preparing with urgency. Troops were mobilized. Supply lines were organized. Scouts gathered intelligence on Mongol movements in Syria. Alliances, even temporary ones, were considered. Every decision carried immense weight. A miscalculation would mean not just defeat in battle, but potential collapse of the last viable Muslim power in the region. What made this confrontation uniquely dangerous was timing. The Mongol Empire was still near the height of its expansion. Though internal dynamics would eventually fracture it into khanates, in 1259 it still projected an image of unified, unstoppable momentum. Its commanders were veterans of campaigns that had humbled empires in China, Persia, and Eastern Europe. And yet, history often hinges on moments when momentum meets resistance. As Mongol forces consolidated control over Syria, they prepared to push into Egypt. The route would likely pass through Palestine, through terrain that could either favor fast-moving cavalry or be used against them. Geography was no longer abstract, it was strategic leverage. Egypt's leaders knew they could not simply wait behind walls. A siege of Cairo would be catastrophic. Instead, they chose a bolder approach: meet the Mongols before they reached the heartland. Take the fight north. Control the battlefield rather than react to it. This shift, from defensive fear to offensive initiative, marked a turning point in mindset. The narrative was no longer, "How do we survive?" but "How do we win?" The stakes could not have been higher. If the Mamluks failed, there would be no second line of defense. No coalition army waiting in reserve. No distant ally marching to reinforce them. The Islamic world's political center had already fallen. Egypt was the final barrier. For ordinary people across the region, farmers, merchants, scholars, the approaching clash represented something beyond politics. It was about continuity. Would their institutions survive? Would their culture endure? Or would they become another footnote in the Mongol expansion? In business terms, this was the difference between extinction and reinvention. In civilizational terms, it was the difference between memory and oblivion. The global crisis created by the Mongol expansion forced every leader to reveal who they truly were. Some chose accommodation. Others fled. A few prepared to resist. As the armies moved toward each other in 1260, the confrontation was no longer hypothetical. It was inevitable. The world-ending threat was no exaggeration in the minds of those living through it. They had seen what happened to cities that misjudged the storm. Now, the question was whether the storm itself could be broken. And in the valley that would soon become known as Ain Jalut, history prepared to answer. In late summer of 1260, two military systems, both forged on the steppe, both disciplined, both ruthless, moved toward a collision that few believed would end in anything but Mongol victory. The confrontation would take place near a spring in northern Palestine, a place known as Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, in what is now modern-day Israel. History would remember it as the Battle of Ain Jalut. The Mongol commander was Kitbuka, a seasoned general of the Mongol Empire, left in charge of the western campaign after Hulagu withdrew much of the main army eastward. Though his force was smaller than the one that had destroyed Baghdad 2 years earlier, it was still formidable, battle-hardened cavalry accustomed to breaking armies through speed, precision, and terror. Facing them was the army of the Mamluk Sultanate, led by Sultan Qutuz and his most aggressive field commander, Baibars. What made this confrontation extraordinary was not just the stakes, but the symmetry. The Mamluks themselves were masters of mounted archery and mobile warfare. They understood steppe tactics because many of them, including Baibars, had grown up within that martial culture. This would not be a clash between a sophisticated empire and a disorganized foe. It would be a contest of systems, speed versus speed, discipline versus discipline, will versus will. Strategic terrain selection. Baibars understood something that many of the Mongols' previous opponents had not. You do not fight the Mongols on ground of their choosing. Their strength lay in open plains where cavalry could maneuver freely, encircle enemies, and unleash waves of arrows from every direction. Ain Jalut was different. The valley was narrow in places, framed by hills and broken terrain. There were wooded areas and undulating ground that could disrupt large-scale cavalry maneuvers. Water sources made it a natural stopping point, which meant the Mongols would be drawn into it, but the geography also limited their ability to execute wide flanking movements. For modern strategists, whether in business, politics, or warfare, the lesson is timeless. Choose the battlefield. Don't compete where your rival is strongest. Shape the environment so their advantages diminish and yours expand. Baibars advanced north into Palestine, engaging Mongol detachments and drawing Kitbuka's forces toward Ain Jalut. The movement was deliberate, controlled, almost bait-like. It signaled confidence, perhaps even vulnerability. Kitbuka accepted the invitation. Psychological warfare. By 1260, the Mongols' most powerful weapon was not their composite bows or their cavalry formations. It was their reputation. Entire cities had surrendered at the mere rumor of their approach. Fear often achieved what arrows did not. But the Mamluks refused to play that role. Before the battle, when Mongol envoys had demanded submission, they were executed, an unmistakable message. Egypt would not kneel. This act alone shattered the psychological script that had worked so effectively across Eurasia. The Mongols were accustomed to watching rulers fold. Now they faced an enemy who openly rejected intimidation. On the battlefield, psychological maneuvering continued. Baibars initiated aggressive skirmishes, testing Mongol reactions, probing their formations. These were not reckless attacks. They were calculated signals designed to convey momentum and resilience. The Mongols were used to being the hunters. At Ain Jalut, they began to feel hunted. The feigned retreat. If there is one tactic synonymous with Mongol warfare, it is the feigned retreat. Time and again, they had lured enemies into overextension by pretending to break ranks and flee, only to turn and encircle their pursuers in a devastating counterattack. At Ain Jalut, Baibars turned the tactic against them. He commanded the Mamluk vanguard and initiated a direct engagement with Kitbuka's forces. Arrows darkened the sky. Cavalry units clashed in bursts of speed and steel. Then, at a critical moment, Baibars ordered a controlled withdrawal. To the Mongols, this looked familiar, almost predictable. The enemy was cracking. The line was giving way. Kitbuka pressed forward. But this retreat was not a collapse. It was choreography. The Mamluks pulled back toward concealed main forces positioned in the hills and behind terrain features that masked their numbers. The Mongols, sensing victory, advanced deeper into the valley, stretching their formations. In high-stakes environments, Whether financial markets or warfare, momentum can be intoxicating. The illusion of victory often blinds leaders to hidden risks. Kitbuka was not careless, but he was confident. And confidence, under the wrong conditions, becomes vulnerability. The ambush. As the Mongol forces surged forward, the trap closed. At the decisive moment, Sultan Qutuz committed the Mamluk reserves. Hidden units emerged from the flanks and high ground, crashing into the Mongol lines. What had appeared to be a retreat transformed instantly into encirclement. The valley that had constrained Mongol maneuverability now worked against them. Their formations, stretched by pursuit, struggled to reorganize under sudden multidirectional assault. Arrows flew at close range. Cavalry collided in brutal, chaotic combat. Contemporary chronicles describe the intensity of the fighting, dust clouds rising, war cries echoing off the hills, the metallic rhythm of steel striking steel. This was no distant exchange of projectiles. It was close, personal, and decisive. At one point, as Mamluk lines wavered under Mongol counterattacks, Qutuz is said to have thrown off his helmet and shouted a rallying cry, invoking faith and survival. Whether embellished or not, the effect was real. The Mamluk forces surged again, stabilizing their lines and pressing the advantage. The Mongols, for perhaps the first time in a major Western campaign, found themselves contained. The duel with Kitbuka. Kitbuka was no minor commander. He had participated in campaigns that shattered kingdoms. Even as the battle turned against him, he reportedly refused to retreat. For Mongol leaders, personal courage was inseparable from authority. To flee too soon risked unraveling morale. Accounts vary in detail, but Kitbuka fought fiercely amid the chaos. Eventually, he was captured. Brought before Qutuz, he is said to have remained defiant, declaring that even if he died, the Mongol Empire would avenge him. His execution marked more than the fall of a general. It symbolized the collapse of Mongol momentum in the region. In warfare, leadership often acts as an anchor. When it breaks, cohesion falters. With Kitbuka dead and their formations shattered, Mongol resistance at Ain Jalut disintegrated. Survivors retreated northward, pursued by Mamluk forces determined to ensure the victory was not temporary. The first major Mongol defeat. Ain Jalut was not the first time Mongol forces had suffered losses. But it was the first decisive, large-scale defeat inflicted by a major regional power in open battle during their westward expansion. The psychological impact was enormous. For decades, the Mongols had seemed invincible, an unstoppable force rewriting the political map of Eurasia. Now they had been stopped. Not by geography alone, not by weather, not by internal division, but by a disciplined army that studied their methods and countered them strategically. The myth of invincibility cracked. For the Islamic world, the victory carried existential weight. Egypt remained independent. The holy cities were secure. Trade networks could continue. A new political center would eventually emerge in Cairo, preserving continuity after the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate. For the Mongols, Ain Jalut marked the western limit of their expansion into the core Middle East. Though they would continue to rule vast territories in Persia and beyond, the momentum toward Egypt and North Africa was broken. From a broader perspective, this battle altered the trajectory of global history. Had Egypt fallen, Mediterranean trade patterns, religious dynamics, and even the balance of power in Europe might have evolved differently. Ain Jalut did not end the Mongol Empire, but it redefined its boundaries. And at the heart of this cinematic confrontation stood Baibars. His understanding of terrain, his manipulation of expectation, and his disciplined execution of a feigned retreat demonstrated that even the most feared system can be outmaneuvered. For modern builders and leaders, the lesson resonates across centuries. Dominant players can be beaten, not by mirroring their strength blindly, but by understanding their model, identifying its assumptions, and exploiting its blind spots. The Mamluks did not win by outscaling the Mongols. They won by outthinking them at a critical moment. In the dust of Ain Jalut, amid broken lances and fallen banners, the world shifted. An empire that had burned cities from China to Mesopotamia had met resistance it could not overwhelm. The storm had been stopped, not by luck, but by strategy, resolve, and the refusal to accept inevitability. Victory on the battlefield often creates a myth, but it also creates a vacuum. When the dust settled after the Battle of Ain Jalut, the army of the Mamluk Sultanate stood as the first power to decisively halt the westward expansion of the Mongol Empire. The immediate threat had been neutralized. Syria was back under Mamluk control. The aura of Mongol invincibility had cracked. But within the Mamluk camp, a different tension was building. Military victories solve external crises. They often ignite internal ones. At the center of this new political reality were two men, Sultan Quz, the ruler who had mobilized Egypt for war, and Baibars, the field commander whose tactical brilliance had shaped the outcome at Ain Jalut. In public, they were allies. In private, their relationship was more complicated. The Mamluk system was not a hereditary monarchy in the European sense. Power did not automatically pass from father to son. It was earned, contested, negotiated, and sometimes taken. Authority rested on military loyalty, personal alliances, and the perception of strength. In such a system, success did not eliminate rivalry, it amplified it. During the campaign in Syria, Baibars had played a leading role in both strategy and execution. Many soldiers admired him. He understood steppe warfare intimately, moved decisively under pressure, and carried himself with confidence. For men who had been trained from youth in a harsh military hierarchy, competence commanded respect. Quz, however, was sultan. He had taken the throne during a time of instability, consolidating power in Cairo and preparing the state for confrontation with the Mongols. Without his decision to resist, and without his willingness to execute Mongol envoys, there would have been no Ain Jalut. But victory reshapes perceptions. As the army moved north after the battle, reclaiming Syrian cities and re-establishing Mamluk authority, expectations shifted. Commanders anticipated rewards. Land grants, governorships, influence. In military cultures, recognition is currency. Baibars reportedly expected appointment as governor of Aleppo, a prestigious and strategic post. Whether this expectation was formally promised or assumed remains debated among historians. What is clearer is that he did not receive it. Instead, Qutuz began consolidating control in ways that may have signaled caution toward his ambitious general. From a ruler's perspective, this was understandable. Baibars was popular, capable, and increasingly visible. In a system without fixed succession rules, a powerful commander could become a rival overnight. For modern leaders, especially entrepreneurs and founders, this moment feels familiar. The traits that make someone indispensable during crisis can make them threatening once stability returns. Wartime leadership and peacetime governance are not the same skill set. And alliances built under existential pressure can fracture once survival is no longer the only priority. The tension between Qutuz and Baibars was not necessarily personal hatred. It was structural. Two strong figures operating in a system that rewarded strength above all else. The breaking point came during the return journey to Egypt in late 1260. Somewhere near Al-Salahiyah, as the victorious army marched home, events unfolded quickly. Accounts vary in detail, but the broad outline is consistent. Qutuz was assassinated by a group of Mamluk officers. Baibars was among them, whether as the primary architect or a leading participant. The assassination was swift. Qutuz, the man who had rallied Egypt against the Mongols, was dead within months of his greatest triumph. In modern terms, this was not just a leadership change. It was a hostile takeover. From an ethical standpoint, the act is unsettling. Qutuz had led the state through one of its gravest threats. Yet in the political ecosystem of the Mamluks, moral judgment was secondary to power dynamics. Legitimacy came from control of the army, of Cairo, of the narrative. Baibars moved decisively. There was no prolonged civil war. No months of uncertainty. Within days he was proclaimed sultan. The transition, though violent, was efficient. That efficiency reveals something critical. Baibars did not act impulsively. He had support. Key commanders aligned with him. The machinery of the state shifted in his favor with remarkable speed. Seizing the throne, however, is not the same as securing it. The step from military hero to political ruler is one of the most difficult transitions in history. On the battlefield, clarity dominates. Defeat the enemy, hold the line, execute the plan. In governance, ambiguity reigns. You must manage alliances, stabilize institutions, generate revenue, administer justice, and anticipate threats both internal and external. Baibars understood this. His first challenge was legitimacy. Unlike hereditary monarchs, he could not point to royal blood. But he could point to victory. Ain Jalut became central to his narrative. He was not merely another ambitious officer, he was the defender of the Islamic world against the Mongol tide. He also moved to strengthen institutional foundations. Recognizing that the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate had left a symbolic void, Baibars later sponsored the installation of a shadow Abbasid Caliph in Cairo, restoring a form of spiritual continuity under Mamluk protection. This was a strategic masterstroke. It anchored his rule within a broader Islamic framework, blending military authority with religious symbolism. At the same time, he reinforced the Mamluk military elite. Promotions, land grants, and appointments were distributed carefully to secure loyalty. In systems built on personal bonds, neglect breeds rebellion. Baibars could not afford fragmentation. Externally, he resumed pressure against remaining Crusader strongholds along the Levantine coast. Fortresses that had stood for decades began to fall one by one under sustained campaigns. By projecting strength outward, he reduced the risk of inward descent. A busy army is a loyal army. There is a powerful lesson here for anyone building or scaling an organization. Crisis leadership earns attention. Sustained leadership requires structure. You must convert momentum into systems. Baibars did not rely solely on charisma. He invested in infrastructure, fortifications, intelligence networks, and communication routes across his realm. He improved postal systems to enable rapid information flow between Cairo and frontier regions. In an era before digital dashboards and real-time analytics, speed of information was strategic leverage. He also cultivated an image of justice and accessibility. Chroniclers describe him as personally engaged, willing to hear grievances, attentive to administration. Whether fully accurate or partially curated, the effect was real: stability. None of this erases the reality of Qutuz's assassination. The moral ambiguity remains. But history often advances through figures who are both builders and disruptors, capable of decisive action in moments when hesitation would mean decline. By the early 1260s, Baibars had completed the transformation. He was no longer merely the commander who helped defeat the Mongols. He was sultan. The implications of that shift were profound. Under his rule, the Mamluk Sultanate would become one of the most formidable powers in the eastern Mediterranean. The victory at Ain Jalut would not be a one-time anomaly but the foundation of sustained resistance against both Mongol incursions and Crusader enclaves. For an American audience accustomed to stories of founders, generals, and presidents, Baibars' rise feels strikingly modern in its arc. He began as property, sold into slavery on the Eurasian steppe. He became a soldier, then a commander. He seized a moment of global crisis, helped alter its outcome, and then navigated the ruthless politics required to hold power. The transition from military hero to political ruler is where many figures fail. Glory in one arena does not guarantee competence in another. Baibars not only crossed that threshold, he redefined it. And in doing so, he ensured that Ain Jalut would not be remembered as an isolated miracle, but as the opening chapter of a new era under his rule. Winning a throne is dramatic. Holding it is strategic. After the assassination of Qutuz and his own ascent to power, Baibars faced a reality far more complex than the battlefield at Ain Jalut. The Mongols were not gone. Crusader strongholds still dotted the Levantine coast. Internal rivalries simmered beneath the surface of the Mamluk Sultanate. Victory had bought breathing room, not security. If Baibars wanted longevity, he needed more than courage. He needed systems. Military reorganization. Baibars understood that the army which saved Egypt could not remain static. Military institutions decay quickly if they rely only on past glory. He reorganized the Mamluk forces with precision, strengthening the Ikta system, the allocation of land revenues to military officers in exchange for service. But he tightened oversight to ensure these grants translated into ready cavalry, not idle wealth. He invested in training and discipline, reinforcing the elite character of the Mamluk corps. These were not conscripts. They were professional warriors, many brought as young slaves from the steppe and trained intensively in mounted archery, swordsmanship, and coordinated maneuver. Loyalty was cultivated through shared identity and patronage. Baibars also expanded recruitment to maintain a steady pipeline of trained soldiers. He knew something many modern leaders forget: elite performance requires constant renewal. Talent pipelines matter as much as current execution. Frontier garrisons were strengthened. Rapid response units were positioned strategically to counter Mongol raids from the northeast. The army was not merely reactive, it became anticipatory. That shift, from responding to threats to shaping them, marked the evolution of Baibars from general to architect. Fortifications and infrastructure. Empires are not sustained by armies alone. They require physical resilience. Baibars invested heavily in fortifications across Syria and Palestine. Castles were repaired, expanded, and modernized. Coastal fortresses captured from crusader forces were reinforced to prevent counterattacks. Strategic choke points were secured. But infrastructure went beyond walls. He improved road networks and caravan routes, ensuring faster troop movement and more reliable communication between Cairo and Damascus. In an era without digital systems, information speed equaled survival. To that end, Baibars enhanced the Barid, the state postal and intelligence network, allowing messages to travel swiftly across vast distances. Relay stations enabled mounted couriers to move with efficiency that rivaled the Mongols' own communications. Think of it as building the 13th century equivalent of a secure fiber optic backbone. Without it, governance fragments. Water systems, bridges, and public works were also restored or expanded. These projects were not vanity endeavors. They signaled stability. They reassured merchants and citizens that the state was investing in continuity. Economic reforms. Military expansion is expensive. So is infrastructure. Baibars needed revenue, but he could not afford economic suffocation. Egypt's agricultural wealth, nourished by the Nile, formed the backbone of the Sultanate's economy. Baibars focused on maintaining irrigation systems and protecting rural productivity. Stable harvests meant stable tax income. He streamlined tax collection and sought to reduce corruption within provincial administration. In systems built on delegated authority, leakage is inevitable. Baibars worked to minimize it, ensuring that state revenue reached central coffers rather than disappearing into private hands. He also demonstrated pragmatic flexibility. Rather than imposing arbitrary burdens, he balanced state needs with commercial vitality. Merchants were not treated as expendable revenue sources, they were strategic assets. For modern entrepreneurs watching the story, the parallel is clear. Scale requires financial architecture. Growth without cash flow discipline collapses. Baibars was not simply extracting wealth, he was structuring sustainability. Trade expansion. Geography favored Egypt. Positioned between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, it sat at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia. Baibars recognized that commerce could be as powerful as cavalry. Despite ongoing conflicts with crusader states, he maintained pragmatic trade arrangements when beneficial. Italian maritime republics, such as Venice and Genoa, continued commercial exchanges with Mamluk ports. Economics often transcends ideology. Spice routes from the Indian Ocean flowed through the Red Sea into Egyptian markets, then onward to Europe. By protecting these corridors, Baibars ensured steady customs revenues and reinforced Cairo's position as a global commercial hub. Security encouraged trade. Trade generated wealth. Wealth funded military readiness. The cycle reinforced itself. Empires fall when they ignore this loop. Baibars cultivated it deliberately. Restoration of the Abbasid Caliphate. One of his most symbolically significant moves was addressing the vacuum left by the Mongol destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258. The fall of Baghdad had not only eliminated a political center, it had shattered spiritual continuity for the Sunni Islamic world. Authority without legitimacy is fragile. Baibars sponsored the installation of a surviving Abbasid prince in Cairo, re-establishing a caliphal presence under Mamluk protection. Though the new caliph held little real political power, the symbolism was immense. This move reframed the Mamluk Sultanate as the defender and inheritor of Islamic continuity. It was Brand's strategy centuries before the term existed. By aligning himself with restored tradition, Baibars strengthened his moral authority across the region. He was no longer merely a strong man who seized a throne. He became guardian of a civilizational legacy. Religious legitimacy. Baibars invested in mosques, madrasas, and religious endowments. Scholars were patronized. Legal institutions were supported. These efforts were not purely pious, they were strategic. In pre-modern societies, religious institutions shaped public perception and social order. By positioning himself as a champion of faith and orthodoxy, Baibars deepened loyalty among urban elites and rural populations alike. He also projected an image of justice. Chronicles describe his attention to public grievances and his visible engagement in governance. Whether entirely authentic or partially cultivated, the perception mattered. Legitimacy is a form of soft power. It reduces the need for coercion. Diplomacy and intelligence network. Externally, Baibars navigated a complex geopolitical landscape. The Mongol Empire had fractured into competing khanates, including the Ilkhanate in Persia. Rather than rely solely on military confrontation, Baibars engaged in diplomatic maneuvering. He opened communication with the Golden Horde Mongols to the north, exploiting internal divisions within the broader Mongol world. If his enemies were not unified, neither should his strategy be singular. Alliances were fluid, pragmatic, and calculated. Baibars understood that survival required flexibility. He avoided ideological rigidity when it undermined strategic advantage. Meanwhile, his intelligence network expanded. Informants, scouts, and local contacts fed information back to Cairo. In uncertain environments, data reduces risk. Baibars' governance reflected a leader who valued awareness as much as aggression. He did not wait for threats to materialize at his gates. He monitored them at their source. From warrior to empire builder. By the 1270s, Baibars had transformed the Mamluk Sultanate from a reactive military state into a structured regional power. Crusader fortresses steadily fell under his campaigns. Mongol incursions were repelled. Trade thrived. Institutions stabilized. The arc of his leadership reveals something profound. At Ain Jalut, he proved that the Mongols could be defeated. As Sultan, he proved that victory could be institutionalized. Many leaders peak during crisis. Few convert crisis performance into durable systems. Baibars did both. For American founders, executives, and creators, the distinction is critical. Winning a single breakthrough moment, a viral product, a major contract, a decisive pivot, is not enough. Longevity requires infrastructure, financial discipline, talent pipelines, brand legitimacy, and strategic alliances. Baibars' reign demonstrates that empire building is less about constant warfare and more about strategic layering. Military strength, economic vitality, symbolic authority, diplomatic agility, each reinforced the others. When he died in 1277, reportedly after a sudden illness, he left behind more than a memory of battlefield heroics. He left a state capable of enduring. The slave who once had no autonomy had constructed a power structure that reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean, not merely through force, but through governance. In that transformation lies his greatest achievement. History rarely gives us clean heroes. It gives us complex figures who rise in violent times and leave behind consequences that outlive them. Baibars was one of those figures. To many in his era, he was the defender of Islam, the ruler who stood between the Middle East and the expanding force of the Mongol Empire after the fall of Baghdad. At a moment when institutions collapsed and fear dominated entire regions, he helped halt what seemed unstoppable. But if his legacy ended at Ain Jalut, he would simply be remembered as a general who won a battle. Instead, he became something more. Baibars evolved into a model of strategic leadership. He reorganized the military, rebuilt infrastructure, restored symbolic legitimacy through the Abbasid line in Cairo, strengthened trade routes, and built intelligence networks that allowed his state to anticipate threats instead of merely reacting to them. He understood that victory is fragile unless it is reinforced by systems. And perhaps most remarkable of all, he began life as a slave. From captured child on the steppe to Sultan of Egypt and Syria, his story forces us to reconsider how we define power. Not by birth, not by comfort, but by adaptability, resilience, and the willingness to step forward when history demands it. His impact was not just regional. By stopping Mongol expansion into Egypt, he preserved a civilizational center that would influence trade, religion, and geopolitics for centuries. The ripple effects reached far beyond his lifetime. So what defines a great leader? Is it courage under pressure? Strategic intelligence? The ability to turn chaos into opportunity? Or is it the discipline to build something that lasts after the crisis fades? If you're building a business, launching a startup, leading a team, or creating something meaningful in today's competitive world, Baibars' story offers a powerful reminder. Dominance is never permanent, but decisive leadership can change the trajectory of history. Now I want to hear from you. What leadership trait do you think mattered most in Baibars' rise? Vision, strategy, boldness, or resilience? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy deep historical breakdowns that connect past empires to modern leadership lessons, make sure to subscribe and explore the next video on this channel. History isn't just about what happened. It's about what we can build because of it.